All right. Welcome back to Teacher Talk. We have just gotten started in chapter 5 of the book of Ephesians. And so we're going back to chapter 5. We're going to pick up again in Paul's list of personal vices that stand in the way of our mission as Christians. Now, last week we studied that Paul was calling upon the church in Ephesus to walk in love as Christ did. And we understood that that means to live self-sacrificially, loving others more than ourselves, putting the needs of others over our needs. And we do all this to show Christ to the world as ambassadors, drawing men and women to Christ. So we're talking about having a missional mindset, which is a mark of spiritual maturity. But when our old nature drives our thinking and our behavior, we cease walking in love. We choose instead to love ourselves. In those moments or seasons, if that applies, but in those moments of our life, we're setting aside our mission. We're taking a vacation from our service to Christ and from our witness to the world. Paul says we shouldn't do that. And then Paul embarked on a laundry list of personal vices that interfere with walking in love. He began with immorality and impurity. He moved on to vulgarity and unhelpful speech. Those two categories alone were enough to convict all of us, I know. But knowing what we should do is one thing. Finding reason to actually do it is an entirely different matter. And Paul understood the challenge that he was placing before the church. So here he interrupts his list of vices for an exhortation to give cause for us to obey these commands. Now it starts in verse 5, it runs till verse 17. Ephesians chapter 5, verse 5. For this you know with certainty that no immoral or impure person or covetous man who is an idolater has an inheritance in the kingdom of Christ and God. Let no one deceive you with empty words, for because of these things the wrath of God comes upon the sons of disobedience. Therefore do not be partakers with them. For you were formerly darkness, but now you are light in the Lord. Walk as children of light. For the fruit of the light consists in all goodness and righteousness and truth, trying to learn what is pleasing to the Lord. So in verse 5, Paul says that people who do the very things that he just counseled against will not see an inheritance in the kingdom. Now, in the Greek, there's no article before the word inheritance. So the better translation would be that none of these people has inheritance in the kingdom. Now, that lack of an article before that word inheritance suggests this is a reference to unbelievers. That is, those who have no part of the kingdom whatsoever. But from there, Paul goes on to contrast believers with unbelievers throughout the rest of the passage. His point is, we can't let the world's behaviors become our testimony, since we have a mission to stand apart from the world. So if we adopt the same behaviors as an unbeliever, Paul says if we become partakers with them, then we have no hope to influence the world for Christ. But then notice how Paul develops his argument. First, he tells the church, don't be deceived by empty words. Now, false teachers were apparently teaching that a Christian's behaviors were not important to God. Once we get saved, once we come to faith, we're saved regardless of how we behave. Therefore, we shouldn't concern ourselves with being holy or pursuing sanctification or whatever. Paul disputes this false teaching with three arguments. First, he says these behaviors bring about God's wrath. For believers, God poured his wrath out on Christ, while unbelievers receive God's wrath personally, themselves. But either way, Paul's point is God detests these behaviors. Knowing these things lead God to pour his wrath out on the world, how can we think God approves of us following in their footsteps? Do we just think that maybe God doesn't mind? Do we expect him just to, turn a blind eye? we may not receive his wrath since he already poured that wrath out on his son for our sake. But nevertheless, we would be foolish to think we can sin with impunity in the meantime. The Lord will not be mocked, not even by his children. So Paul's first point is that we know these things are not acceptable to God because he says they're deserving of his wrath. Secondly, Paul says we're not called to be partakers with the world. Now, the Greek word for partaker can be translated partner or one who shares something with another. We aren't supposed to share the same testimony or lifestyle as that of unbelievers. We are to live missionally, which requires that we walk a different path. It's as if believers and unbelievers are both salespeople, each pitching a different product. Unbelievers are declaring that what they offer tastes great, and the church is declaring that what we offer is less filling. But what if we adopted their slogan? They said, tastes great, and our response was, tastes great. That's what happens when we act like them and look like them. Their slogan becomes our slogan because their product becomes our product. Missional thinking understands that we can't look like the world or else we don't have anything to offer them. In verse 8, Paul says, remember you were taken out of their world and brought into a new life by his grace. You were once a salesman for the product of darkness. Now you're selling the product of light. So walk as children of the light, which means displaying goodness and representing truth. So Paul's second argument is that we must look different than the world if we're to influence the world. Okay? That leads us to verse 10, which is Paul's third argument. He says we are to live for the goal of pleasing the Lord, not ourselves. Now, the Christian who thinks he or she can do whatever they want because we've already been forgiven by the blood of Christ is seeking only to please himself or herself. That's not the goal of a Christian life. Notice Paul says in verse 10, we are trying to learn what pleases Christ. The phrase trying to learn is a single Greek word, and it means to prove something. It's the same Greek word that's used in Romans 12:2 when Paul says, do not be conformed to this world, but be ye transformed by the renewing of your mind, so that you may prove what the will of God is, that which is good and acceptable and perfect. So Paul isn't suggesting that we're all searching to know what Christ wants, like it's, some big mystery that we have to figure out. We already know what pleases Christ because it's in his word. Paul means we prove to the world what pleases Christ. We are walking billboards displaying godliness and holiness. When people witness us living differently, they get proof of what pleases Christ. They learn that God is pleased when we keep his commands, that he is pleased when we walk in love, and he is pleased when we serve him in our mission. And we prove these truths by our lifestyle. But take a second look at how Paul began this passage. He opened in verse 5 saying, you know with certainty. Paul strings together two different Greek words for you know. In effect, Paul is saying, you know that you know. He's emphasizing this truth is something believers can't deny. We can't pretend we haven't heard it, and we can't hope that it isn't true. We know that unbelievers have no inheritance in the kingdom. Now, this is an odd way for Paul to describe unbelievers, that is, as those without inheritance in the kingdom. And it's oddly specific because, unbelievers don't have any inheritance in the kingdom. It's the truth. They won't even be in the kingdom. So why make a reference to an unbeliever's lack of inheritance? Well, I think Paul chose that odd reference to remind believers that we need to think about how our behavior affects or impacts our inheritance. Living like the world means potentially sacrificing something in the kingdom. Okay? Let me say that again. Living like the world means potentially sacrificing something in the kingdom. And actually, this becomes Paul's fourth argument against sharing in the world's behaviors, because not only are we testing God, not only are we failing to stand apart from the world, not only are we not pleasing Christ, but we're taking risks with our reward. So rather than joining in the world's behaviors, Paul says we have to go in an opposite direction. Look at verse 11. Do not participate in the unfruitful deeds of darkness, but instead even expose them. For it is disgraceful even to speak of the things which are done by them in secret. But all things become visible when they are exposed by the light. For everything that becomes visible is light. For this reason it says, awake, sleeper, and arise from the dead, and Christ will shine on you. So Paul says here, don't participate in the unfruitful deeds of darkness. Now, here again, his mention of bearing fruit or the lack thereof alludes to our inheritance. We will gain nothing by following after the world's example. But on the other hand, we bear fruit for God when we obey him. When we live a called out life, Paul says we expose the deeds of darkness. That's an important principle of Christian witnessing, but it can be misunderstood in practice. The principle is this. When we live a life following Christ, we expose the sin in the world, which is the purpose of the church on earth. It's the principle of contrast. All right. Differences in form suggest differences in meaning. When two things differ in appearance, they represent differences in meaning or differences in message. For example, the color red in a traffic light contrasts starkly with the color green. The contrast between the colors indicates to us a different meaning. In this case, it's stop versus go. And even if you're colorblind, you still get a contrast. You know it's not the same color. Now, because the location of each colored light is contrasted, red's on top, green's on bottom, it reinforces there's a difference in the meaning. Red doesn't mean the same as green. So it has to be for the church if we're going to fulfill our mission. Our choices are supposed to contrast with the world's choices so we can convey a different meaning, a different message. That's what Paul means when he says we expose the deeds of darkness. Our life of godliness sheds light on the world's evil, but it goes beyond merely exposing evil. In fact, the Greek word translated expose actually means to refute. So by our life, we are refuting the world's perspective. For example, they say humans evolved from animals. By how we live, we testify we were created in God's image. The world says fleshly desires are natural and they can't be judged, no matter how depraved, no matter how selfish. We testify that we are desperately wicked by nature and deserving of judgment, yet by grace, we can be rescued. The world says we are living meaningless and temporary lives of quiet desperation, so just get all you can while you can. We testify that everyone has an eternal future. Therefore, consider carefully what comes after death. Now, as obvious as the principle of contrast might be, some Christians misunderstand how the Bible expects us to put this principle into practice. Some Christians think it's about what we say rather than what we do. So they choose to expose the world's sin only using their mouth rather than living a holy lifestyle. They call out others' sin while they're failing to deal with their own. We've all seen examples of such misdirected witnessing for Christ. Like Christians who post condemning messages online against homosexuality, yet at the same time they praise movies depicting sex and violence or music laced with obscenities. They protest legalized abortion, but they turn a blind eye to unmarried Christian couples living together. They complain about the ungodliness inside public schools while raising kids that use profanity and pornography. So when Paul says we are to expose the deeds of darkness, we need to understand he's talking about our behavior, not just our words. We are to preach the gospel every day and everywhere, but only use words when necessary. Our mission is to live a called out life before our neighbors, not to call out our neighbors for their sinful life. To do otherwise is to risk becoming known for what we're against rather than to be known for who we serve. That's why Paul says in verse 12, it's disgraceful to even speak of the things the world does in secret. He's saying that when it comes to dealing with the gross immoralities that characterize the world, believers need less talk and more walk. It's unwholesome to even discuss the evil that runs rampant around us because the Bible tells us to separate ourselves from the things of the world. That means moving so far away from it, we're not even drawn into conversations about that type of stuff. So when your colleagues at the water cooler or your friends between classes are entertaining discussion of evil things, just step away. Because in the end, apologetics isn't about bringing powerful arguments into those moments. It's about having a convicting testimony so that through living a called out life, you expose the evil of the world. And then that exposure may then lead to an opportunity for you to give your testimony. Some people might be convicted by your lifestyle, and they'll ask you to give a defense for the hope in you. At that point, you will have skipped past the need to discuss disgraceful things. You'll be speaking about the Lord and his love and his grace. That's what Paul means when he says the evil things of the world become visible when they are exposed by light, because light exposes everything. Living a life that puts away sin and obeys the Lord is light in an evil world. Jesus told us in Matthew 5:14, he said, "You are the light of the world. A city set on a hill cannot be hidden, nor does anyone light a lamp and put it under a basket, but on the lampstand, and it gives light to all who are in the house. Let your light shine before men in such a way that they may see your good works and glorify your Father who is in heaven." So collectively, as a whole, the church is to be a light in the world. The Lord placed us in the world to make the truth visible. When we live differently than the world, we shine a light that exposes their darkness. Jesus just said in that verse we just read in verse 16, our light is our good works, not our good words. Look at that verse again. Let your light shine before men in such a way that they may see your good works. Isn't it interesting how often, as we plan ways to reach the world for Christ, our thoughts run first to better ways we can communicate better about Christ? We make flyers, billboards, websites, programs, videos. We start to think that our mission is to talk about Christ, but the Bible says that's putting the cart before the horse. Our mission begins with how we live, so that through good deeds we bring light to darkness, and then we follow that with our words. Ironically, if we were to talk to the world about Christ and about our church, but at the same time we mimic the world's behaviors and habits and speech and values and all of that, we would shed no spiritual light despite our words, because we blend into the world. We share in the darkness. But if you turn that around, when we live a called out life before the world, showing kindness and charity to everyone while restraining our speech, we live a life in purity and self-restraint, steering clear of the bad behavior of the world, and even going so far as to excuse ourselves when conversations turn to sordid or vulgar topics, then Paul says we will be serving the mission of bringing light into darkness, even if we should say nothing about Christ. And in the end, your lifestyle will lead to opportunity to testify, because sooner or later, someone's going to ask you important questions. Someone in a crisis is going to come to you for spiritual support because they remember you lived in a peace others lacked. Someone convicted in their sin by your called out life will ask how they can rise above their sin too. And in those moments, you'll share your testimony, and it'll have the power to work far beyond your expectations, because your life testimony preceded your testimony of words. And in that way, you brought light into that person's dark world. Paul sums up his arguments in verse 14 by quoting what might have been an early Christian hymn or poem. He says to the believer, "Awake and rise from the dead, so Christ may shine on you." It's probably a hymn paraphrasing of Isaiah 60, verse 1. It's an elegant, concise summary of everything Paul's been teaching. Having been saved and made alive in Christ spiritually, now we have to awaken from the dead life we lived before faith. That's another way of saying we have to take off that old nature and put on the new self in behavioral terms. Our spiritual nature has already changed. That is, we're awake. But now the time has come to rise up out of bed and get to work. A lot of Christians are still lying in bed, folks. Like a person who's been woke up by their alarm clock, they reach over to silence the alarm, but they think, man, this bed sure feels comfortable. It'd be so easy just to stay in that bed and fall right back to sleep. But they know they got to get up because they have to get to work, or they have to get to school, or they got to get the kids ready, or whatever. Getting out of bed requires a degree of effort and commitment and sacrifice. It doesn't feel good. But we will ourselves to do what's right, even though it runs against the desires of our flesh. And we do it because we want the blessings that come from our paycheck, or from the degree that we're pursuing, or whatever it is that we're getting out of bed for. And we know that if we stay in bed, that good feeling passes very quickly, and before long, we'll regret putting something far greater at risk. That's what the hymn means when it says Christ will shine on you. It's a reference to the blessing that Christ will bring to those who make the effort to leave their dead life behind. If we rise to follow Christ, we will know his pleasure, which is reflected in our reward. That's our motivation to turn off the snooze and crawl out of that comfortable bed. And it's a decision to forego temporary pleasure to gain eternal blessings. Now, in verse 15 through 17, Paul concludes. He says, "Therefore be careful how you walk, not as unwise men, but as wise, making the most of your time, because the days are evil. So then do not be foolish, but understand what the will of the Lord is." So let's be careful how we live our Christian life, our walk with Christ. Don't be unwise. He's saying don't make foolish trade-offs, like deciding to stay in bed an extra hour or two at the risk of being fired or failing a class is an obviously unwise choice. But in the same way, electing to live in immorality or impurity or greed or vulgarity or any way that pleases the flesh and displeases the Lord, that's also an unwise choice. It's trading something eternal and weighty for something temporary and meaningless. But instead, Paul tells us to make the most of your time. Your time refers to the number of days each of us has been appointed to live on the earth. Okay, and people don't like to talk too much about mortality, but everyone knows it. No one lives forever. There, I said it. We have a limited time to serve Christ, to prove ourselves faithful servants. I'll be 65 on June 30th. And I can sense the time slipping away. My walk began when I came to Christ, well, between the ages of 14 and 20. Let's also assume I'll be blessed to live until age 80. That gives me, 60 years of opportunity? And that sounds like a whole lot of time, but if that sounds a whole lot of time, sounds like a whole lot of time to you, you're probably under the age of 25, because to anyone past middle age, it doesn't sound like much. And it isn't. It's only about 18,000 days. And then consider I've already reached the age of 65. It means I only have a little over, 5 or 10,000 days left, give or take. If I live to be 80, if I die tomorrow, it's even less. So no matter what age I am, what age you are, who's to say how many years we have left? So Paul says, count each day, maximize its potential. Don't worry about the days that are already gone. You can't do anything about them anyway. Think about what's left and ask yourself, how am I going to use each of those days to bring light to the world? And then you got to ask yourself, what behaviors still stand in the way? Paul is asking us to make the most of those days. Why waste even one? Paul says we need to do that because the days are evil. He means if we don't make a plan and a commitment to use the days well, the evil of the world around us and of our flesh will probably get the better of us. We may go to bed with the best of intentions to get up early and make it to work on time, but if all we have is good intentions, then hope isn't a plan. So when the moment of decision comes, the evil in our flesh will likely pull us off our goal. Heard a story about a guy, he was notorious for sleeping soundly. His alarm clock would go off, but he'd silence it without even waking up. You know anybody like that? He was constantly late for school or work. He was sleeping at his brother's house the night that his sister-in-law went into labor with their first child. Despite all the commotion and all the stuff that was going on, he never woke up. They tried to wake him as they were leaving the house for the hospital. No matter how hard they shook him, he wouldn't wake up. So eventually, he had to make a plan to be sure he woke up in the morning. So he bought the loudest alarm that he could find, and he put it on the other side of his bedroom. So he'd have to get up out of bed when it went off. That's Paul's charge to us today. We have to make plans in our life that'll guard us from ourselves and lead us to make the most of each day that we have left. Then we can live out the testimony that we've been given. For the purpose of glorifying our Father in heaven, leading to the potential for greater blessing in the kingdom to come. That's it for Teacher Talk this week. We will see you next week, Lord willing. Till then, God bless.